One of the commissions recommended 10,000 rupees compensation, which is like £100 per dead person, which is insignificant.
Dillon Committee in 1985, under veteran Congress leader, was instituted to look into the rehabilitation of victims and their families. A compensation of 10,000 was mandated for the families of those who'd lost lives, and 2,000 for those who had been raped, basically who had survived, had injuries, and that's £18. The claim that if 84 had happened today, the world would have been different. If they had known of what happened, the world would have reacted differently. The world knew then, and the world knows now. The Western world, that is, it doesn't act any differently.
When you have a gold coin and you want to put your stamp on there, first you have to heat the gold up and then you have to melt it and you pour it into the mold and then you stamp it. And that is how we can understand the Indian state's violence, that it was a crucible to form us in a way that was valuable to the state, to form us into the Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, you're either the loyal soldier or you're the loyal farmer, you're the Annadata, or you're the nefarious terrorist which needs to be destroyed and melted down and reformed so you fit into the mold that the state creates. The state is a crucible to destroy any indigenous claim that we have to our Patshahi, our Raj, Potta Singh, Garja Singh, right? Like the example that's often talked about, the Mughals were riding by and Potta Singh, Garja Singh were in the jungle and they overheard the Mughal soldiers saying the Sikhs are you can't even find a single Sikh, and we're laughing at that, and they jumped out and they set up a checkpoint. The purpose of them doing that wasn't to teach the Mughals a lesson, wasn't to collect a tax from Mughals, it was to remind the Sikh of what their position is in these circumstances. It was for us to remember their stand and how their shahidi, their martyrdom, is bearing witness. Like that's what shahadat means as well, like you're bearing witness. It wasn't asking the Mughal government or those soldiers to bear witness, it was for us to bear witness.
Welcome back to part 3 of this special podcast series marking 40 years since November 1984. In the first 2 episodes, we went through the life of Indira Gandhi from when she came into power in 1966, if I'm correct, and her actions and the way she treated those within India at that time who opposed her or her rule, leading up to her assassination, which took place in 1984. We also spoke about the massacres that took place within November 1984 from the 31st of October, mainly from November the 1st onwards, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, in a lot of detail. We went through what happened on those days. A lot of the accounts, very emotional, as well, a lot to sit with. So that's why in episode 2, we left that with the Sangat, and we finished off with some advice for the Sangat at the end of part 2 as well. So in this podcast, now we're going to speak about what was the reaction, what was the response from the Khalsa Panth, from the Sikhs at that time after this had taken place in November 1984. And just before we start, I just had a question for you guys, which is that how should we view November 1984, this Sikh genocide after 40 years?
I think that's like one of the most important questions, because I think now, over the last 40 years, what I've seen and experienced, the way November is viewed viewed by a lot of people in isolation as a tragedy, and a lot of Sikh organizations and like Indians, like they have the same kind of tagline that following the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards, that either riots or genocide, depending on which side you're on, erupted. But it looks at like that anti-Sikh state violence as something that occurs in November. And it breaks the continuity of how Sikhs should locate November as part of this ongoing struggle, as part of this Sangharsh. Because for Sikhs, there is a name for all of these conditions. There's a name for what we're doing, like which is Sangharsh, which is struggle. And there's a name for the violence that we're experiencing from the Indian state, whether it's like before 1984, like the incidences of Biadbi that are happening, in 1978, which we've talked about in previous podcasts. The state's response is very clear, and is anti-Sikh in nature. And Sant Jarnail Singh terms those conditions Gulami, that we're subjugated. But when we try to describe November or like the state's violence, we use words that also reinforce that break in continuity. So we'll talk about state violence or repression or state terror or genocide, or today, like we talk about disinformation And a term that's become popular is transnational repression. And that puts like the state's violence into these like broken up categories, which is kind of unfortunate. But it also shows like this really important problem is that we don't have, outside of Santji's framing, outside of the framing that we get from the Khalistan struggle of Sangharsh of Gulami, we don't actually have a name for the violence of the Indian state. So when we look at November, we're like, this is a genocide. Or many people might look at June 1984 and say, oh, this is a genocide. This is when it started. Or some people use that term today and say, look what's happening in Punjab with the displacement in Punjab, the undermining of Punjab's agriculture, the diversion of its river waters, flooding of like alcohol, drugs, and incentivizing those types of industries in Punjab as, I've heard it described as a silent genocide. So really, to understand and put November in its place, we have to use that framing that Sant Jarnail Singh and the Sangharsh gives us, that this is a struggle, this is a Sangharsh, and the violence we're seeing from the state is symptoms of being subjugated. And the Indian state never looks at November in any holistic way. They look at it in that same way, which is they want to break the continuity. So they want to look at it as isolated, as Indira was assassinated and then this reaction happened. They want to look at it, in disconnected little pieces, like what's happening today is different from what's happening in 1984, when in fact it's an underlying policy from the government, which we talked about like in a lot of depth in previous episodes. But that underlying policy from the state is to destroy Punjab economically, agriculturally, socially, and undermine the Sikh roots and the Sikh connection that exists in Punjab, that kind of is the foundation of everything, is the foundation of every struggle. So that's why they'll look at Sant Jarnail Singh and they'll say Sant Jarnail Singh wasn't a Sikh, or he was a religious fanatic, or those Sikhs, the Amrit itself is a distortion of Sikhi, or it's a different kind of Sikhi. So Sikhi itself becomes the target. So yeah, from the state, there is this very clear policy. And in order to understand that policy, we have to give it a frame of reference. So that is counter-insurgency, counter-revolutionary activity, or which we could, in brief terms call anti-Sikh activity. But in reality, what's happening in November, what happens in June, what's happening today is all designed to undermine the Sikh struggle for liberation, to take out the politics of it and to turn it into, there was an isolated incident and, people were angry and Sikhs were killed. Therefore, there should be an inquiry or an investigation. And I deliberately don't say justice, because justice is actually our word. So when we look at November, Sikhs are the ones that are saying that we want justice for it. The state's words were never justice. All of the commissions that happened following November are all about investigating what happened. We need to find out what happened. We need to give compensation to the victims. Justice is our projection. In reality, justice isn't our term. Our term is Azadi. Our term is Sangharsh. Our term is Khalistan. That's what we want. And there's no justice under Indian occupation. And the question of justice after victory, what that looks like, is a question of imagining what a sovereign Sikh Raj looks like. That's a completely different question. That's not about, a wrong was done to us, and in return for that wrong, we want people punished, we want compensation. Justice after victory is about imagining Khalsa Raj. And justice under occupation is an equation that keeps us in that state of Gulami. So if we look at November as disconnected from June, as disconnected from the annexation of Punjab, as disconnected from the Sikh desire for Halimi Raj, if we look at it as disconnected from the previous Kallukare, our Atiyas, then we keep it within the frame that the state wants to keep it, which is to keep us Gulam, and the state wants to remove this equation of we're fighting for our liberation, and we keep looking towards the government for justice. And that is, I think, one of the biggest tragedies after like the level of genocidal violence itself, that we put the Sikh Qaum, the nation, in a position where it starts looking towards the Indian state for justice. And that erases the entire larger picture, it takes away the framing of Sangharsh, of Gulami versus Azadi. It puts us in that position of the victim. And again, for me, like the most startling thing is that justice is our projection, our desire from the state, not the state's term, because they're very clear, it's investigation. And in fact, like, you know, after November, immediately after the assassination, after the violence, the Indian Prime Minister's response is, you know, a big tree falls, the ground's going to shake a little. And anything that was done in terms of investigation was done to benefit the government, not Sikhs. They were all out in their justification of what took place. They were all out in their justification of what happened in June, that we had to save you from yourselves. What happened in November was just an isolated incident. So if we put November in that sense of tragedy, that we need justice for it, we're putting it squarely back into that frame.
Silly question. Then how have we kind of got to this situation now where we've looked at it as an isolated event? Because to be honest, when I came into Sikhi, the way it was kind of even taught to us was that it was just this happened, and because of this happening, the assassination, this was the result of that, which was the reaction. So how come till this present day, that's kind of the only narrative that's kind of being told to everyone?
I think we see this problem with most of recent Sikh political history. So whether you look at from 1978 onwards, when people talk about that history, they cherry pick. So if you talk about 1978, the majority of people would want to talk about how 13 Guru Sikhs were innocently killed and were shaheed, but no one wants to talk about how following that, ਅਸੀਂ ਗਿਣ ਗਿਣ ਕੇ ਬਦਲੇ ਵੀ ਲਿਆ. Like those ਜਿਹੜੇ Guru Sikh who were shaheed, their companions, their Sati Singhs, then launched this campaign against the Nirankaris. So that's the issue, you know, and it's particularly an issue for us out in the West. So in Punjab, they're very clear about what November means, what June means to them, and how it ties into this longer struggle. So I believe it comes from fear that we don't feel comfortable perhaps to talk about the whole picture, but then we don't do it justice to the actual the whole the whole Sukha in its context. And it's really important because if you look at November, the reason why they want it to be limited to those 50 or 60 Congress leaders and those victims and those survivors is because that's something that in the state's mind eventually they could see closure to, they could see a conclusion to, give them this much money, the cases won't have to be filed now because most of the people, the perpetrators, are dead, and now that ojli gal ho gaya. But the larger issue of Sikh sovereignty, of Azadi, which is why November happens in the first place, that remains unresolved.
Justice comes from that whole relationship, right, with like the state, by putting our hopes and our aspirations in the pocket, in the lap of the Indian state. And like Baljit Singh was saying, it's had more of an impact on the diaspora, and it's become like today it's become like a completely normalized part of our understanding. Like I've even heard it like as a slogan in like one of the June 84 rallies, like, you know, Sikhs shouting, what do we want? Justice. When do we want it now? But really, like, you know, the chant is, what do we want? Khalistan. When do we want it now? But it's become part of our psyche because we're put into this position that the state is the natural entity, the government is the natural entity, and what we see in November is an aberration. It's a unique incident. It just occurred once. It's not going to occur again. But the reality of the Indian state or any state is to erase the sovereignty of every other entity except the state itself. So that doesn't just apply to Sikhs, right, in Punjab and the Indian state. That applies to indigenous people in Canada. That applies to indigenous people in Australia and America. That the state claims exclusive sovereignty. So if you challenge the state, then you are a legitimate target. The state can do whatever it wants. It can use whatever means it has at its disposal to destroy you. So where the state becomes a natural entity, it takes place of essentially Rab, like you're asking for insaf from the entity that is created to destroy and displace you. So immediately after November, the Indian state engages in censorship, and it engages in propaganda and pushing a certain narrative that, like, the word riot just doesn't occur like out of a vacuum. It just doesn't happen randomly. Is because they controlled the media, they censored, like, publications. They pushed out a particular narrative of riots, and we need to investigate. But in reality, they benefited from that anti-Sikh sentiment in terms of elections. They gave the senior political perpetrators rewards and promotions. They continued the same approach to Punjab that they had before, which is this, looking at Punjab as a place in crisis and of law and order that needs to be resolved. And the worst thing, actually, before we get to the worst thing, the survivors of November, they kept them in camps. Then they demolished those camps. They sent them back to live in their burnt out houses. They stayed in a state of destitution, in neglect. So they showed like their position towards you very clear. And then at the same time, the government's launching a violent counter-insurgency. So their military approach, their approach of destroying and annihilating Sikhs doesn't end in November. This continues for a decade afterwards, where they make every Amritdhari Naujawan in particular a target. Sikhs between the age of 15 and 55, I think it was, they make them a target, and they go into the villages, and for a decade they empower the police and the military to carry out what they call counter-insurgency operations, because they viewed the struggle in that sense militarily, like when I was talking about policy, that was their policy to destroy the Sikh liberation struggle and this desire for Azadi.
You've mentioned quite a few times about June and November and that they were pre-planned. But if they were pre-planned, then what was the objective? What was the government trying to get out of doing this, basically?
So the commission, or this investigation and the extrajudicial murder and sending tanks in and the counterinsurgent violence, they're all the same thing. And their goal of this is to assimilate, placate, or annihilate. And I heard a singer in Punjab describe it in perhaps the most poetic way, which was when you want to, you give an analogy of minting a coin. Like when you have a gold coin and you want to put your stamp on there, you want to put the insignia on the coin. First, you have to heat the gold up, and then you have to melt it, and you pour it into the mold, and then you stamp it. And that is how we can understand the Indian state's violence, that it was a crucible to form us in a way that was valuable to the state, to form us into the Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, you're either the loyal soldier, or you're the loyal farmer, you're the Annadata, or you're the nefarious terrorist which needs to be destroyed and melted down and reformed so you fit into the mold that the state creates. The state is a crucible to destroy any indigenous claim that we have to our Patshahi, our Raj. So that's why I say, like, when we look at the state for justice, when we say, this commission or this trial is going to result in something, that trial and the extrajudicial murder are the exact same thing, because the underlying law that we're looking to from the Indian Supreme Court, that same law is being enacted in a genocidal manner from the police and the paramilitary on the ground in Punjab. So the clear goal here is that either you assimilate, and if we can't assimilate you, then we're going to annihilate you. And if either of those don't work, the middle ground is we want to placate you. We want to give you something that calms you down, that whether that's drugs, whether that's, this desire for, a capitalist, materialistic life where, go outside of Punjab, or whether it's drugs or whatever it is designed to placate Sikh rebellion and Sikh desire for Azadi and remove that from the equation. So that's why I say there can't be any notion of justice within that framework, within the structure and the confines of the Indian state.
If you view it from that perspective as well, even the court processes and the commission, if Sikhs were to engage with that furthers that objective. Because even if they're seeking quote unquote justice within the Indian system and they have to, punish a few low level individuals, the fact that the Sikhs are still engaging within that system, that's a victory for them, because now they're bringing them in, right? Because you only engage with the system that rules you, in that sense.
It's interesting because I could be wrong, but when I look at all of history, Sikh Itihas, you never see these kind of examples of what's happening today, I guess, where now Sikhs are kind of engaging with that body that has actually caused them all that pain and try to get justice through them. If you look all over Itihas, I've never seen an example of that, and hence it's happening now. And we can see that the results of it are that we're still stuck in this kind of this cycle, and we've not got that justice that the Sikhs will get for themselves in the past, right?
And I think before I used to think about it, like theoretically, how much of a travesty it was that we forced those widows and those children back into that same system, back into the same hands of those people who inflicted this violence on them. But what's worse is when you actually go through individual cases, you realize that it was literally the same hands. So it was the same police officers, it was the same politicians that they had to then engage with who had committed these atrocities. And that's on us if we're pushing that, right?
And you talk about Sikh Ityas. So all the examples that we have from Sikh Ityas when Sikhs took a stand, or they confronted really brutal conditions, that wasn't to teach the enemy a lesson, like Bhutta Singh, Garja Singh, right? Like the example that's often talked about is the Mughals were riding by, and Bhutta Singh, Garja Singh were in the jungle, and they overheard the Mughal soldiers saying the Sikhs are destroyed and no one's, you can't even find a single Sikh, and we're laughing at that, and they jumped out and they set up a checkpoint. The purpose of them doing that wasn't to teach the Mughals a lesson, wasn't to collect a tax from the Mughals, it was to remind the Sikh of what their position is in these circumstances. It was for us to remember their stand and how their shahidi, their martyrdom is bearing witness. Like that's what shahadat means as well, right? You bearing witness. But it wasn't that they were asking the Mughal government or those soldiers to bear witness. It was for us to bear witness. And that echoes throughout all of our Ityasic stands that we see that take place at Darbar Sahib, that take place during the 18th century. It was to remind the future generations, like Vadda Kallu Kara, Shota Kallu Kara. In Panth Prakash they say, like, jo nikas ge o raj le, jo mare gur par jaye. That after the Vadda Kallu Kara, where half of the Sikh Panth is shaheed in one day, the Gurmata that the Khalsa did is that whoever escapes and whoever's left after this encirclement, this entrapment, their duty is now to attain Raj, and those that have died, those that have become martyrs, they're in Guru's charan. So it's always been that position that what are we going to leave the future generations? This what we have today is this wait and see approach, and it becomes even more poignant because today it's like, let's wait and see, let's let this this so-called mechanism of justice, the commission, the inquiry, the investigation, the United Nations resolution, let's wait and see and give it a chance. And it's more like it's not the word's not poignant, it's more delusional today, because in the 80s, immediately following Darbar Sahib, June 84, immediately following 84, the UN isn't like as discredited as it is today, is like being a complete toothless tiger. Today UN peacekeepers are being shot, and like they have no mechanism to prevent atrocities occurring, whether that's in Israel or Darfur. There's no mechanism. But in the 80s, 84, you could perhaps argue that that track record wasn't set yet. So it would have made sense for Sukha and Jinda, for example, or the shaheeds from that time period, for them to be like, let's wait and see. Let's see what the international community does, and then we're going to decide what our next reaction is going to be. And that could be completely justified for them if we look back. But that wasn't their approach at all. They didn't wait and see. They didn't, they didn't put any faith in the government carrying out an investigation or a commission, or the United Nations hearing a cry of Sikhs. Their approach was completely different.
So what was the international community's response to this?
The international community's response, I think, like Margaret Thatcher, who saw like Gandhi as a kindred spirit or whatever. They went to the same college in Oxford University. They were both like female leaders. They both had this reputation of being like iron, quote unquote, iron ladies, and they had a reputation of responding with decisive military action to anybody that challenges them. So Margaret Thatcher's thing was that Indira Gandhi's assassination was deplorable and condemnable, and it's like a huge affront to democracy. So outright condemnation for the assassination of Indira Gandhi. No such condemnation towards the state violence that's taking place. And when Indira Gandhi is assassinated, over 100 world leaders are there in Delhi for her funeral, state honors, etc. And
witnesses talk about how the smoke was hanged over Delhi. They talked about how like this, you could smell it in the air.
What day was the funeral again?
The 3rd of November.
3rd of November.
Yeah. So literally, that was the last day of the major violence, and that's when the army and that's when the government basically said, it's the same system, the same cycle they did in Gujarat later on, where they said 3 days, do whatever you have to commit genocide, and then after 3 days it has to stop. And then as soon as they want to stop it, they stop it. For the funeral, and loads of people actually didn't turn up for the funeral because of the fear of all the violence that was happening, not even just the normal Indian citizens. So in that backdrop, those world leaders were falling over backwards to give tribute to Indira. So this idea, and Shamsher will hopefully talk about this later, about where we get this idea from, like this benevolent Western kind of hero or savior. But after June, Jadon Darbar Sahib te hamla honda, this is the conversation that's taking place in the British government, right? There's a top secret memo that's sent within the ministers, and they talk about, and this is the 22nd of June, they talk about how British commercial interests in India were very substantial, and it was a large and growing market for both commercial and defence sales, and British exports in 83 exceeded 800 million. And since 1975, India had bought equipment, like British defence equipment, worth over 1.25 billion. So what they were saying was that we have to be very careful because obviously Sikhs are upset, but at the same time, like, this is what we got to concentrate on. So just think about that for us. There's thousands of Sikhs, innocent pilgrims, innocent Sangat hegi, they're shaheed, and this is what the British, knowing fully well, being that they were involved, that the SAS had advised on the attack as well, fully involved, fully understood what happened, and that's their consideration. And later in November, this cabinet meeting minutes from the 22nd of November, again, there's no shortage of documentation of journalists, of articles, about what took place in November. So there's no one in the Western world is under any illusion of what took place. But yet the cabinet meeting minutes on the 22nd of November 1984 was regarding a Nagar Kirtan that Sikhs wanted to take out through central London. Because if you remember, after June we did that. There was a Hyde Park rally and it was a huge Majara. And when the Sikhs wanted to, on Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab, take out a Nagar Kirtan through central London, they had a high-level government meeting which included the foreign minister and other high senior ministers. And Geoffrey Howe, the foreign minister at the time, said that the British High Commission in New Delhi has been reporting continuing threats in Indian government circles of a trade boycott in the event of behaviour by the Sikhs in the UK, which the Indians might regard as provocative. They said export contracts worth 5 billion could be at stake. And Margaret Thatcher, her decision on this was that they shouldn't just remain passive, and that the postponement wasn't good enough, that there should be a ban, and then they banned it. So they banned the Nagar Kirtan. So this is where their interests have always lied, and it's only we're foolish to believe that position will ever change.
And they were clear from, like Nabil Singh said, from June following, before June, after November, that their interest is in securing trade relations, and it was never about anything else. It was never about condemning the Indian state, condemning its violence,
securing trade contracts, and also if they could somehow benefit of any war, of any battle that that's taking place between the Sikhs and India, then even better.
It's always been about securing trade relations, and that's the same thing today. It's never been about condemning India. It's never been about talking about the underlying political conflict, that the Sikh Qawm has its own claim to Padshahi, its own sovereignty, and the creation of the Indian state destroyed that. And that's what Sikhs are struggling for, to express and exert their Padshahi in the world, to have a place where that they can live, where they can have a Raj in Punjab again. That's what's underlying all of this. And like even today, you see the exact same pattern. Like I think there was like a 2018 WikiLeaks cable that was declassified that talked about when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh apologized on behalf of of India to Sikhs for what happened in November. Like the Deputy Commissioner of America was saying, what you did was really good. There's communication between the two, and that was like the first time an official of a foreign government said something that was remotely in the realm of condemnation. So the starting point for them isn't even justice. It's definitely not condemnation. And then hardly ever going to get to this question of like Khalistan or Raj or sovereignty. That's like completely off the table because, for example, like countries like Canada, where, right now there's supposedly a rolla between like Canada and India over like by Hardeep Singh, the Indian government assassinating him. The conversation isn't about Sikh sovereignty. It's about Canadian sovereignty. And underlying all of it is how can we normalize relations? How can we get back to a point where India is a crucial trade partner for us? How can we get back to a point where we can discuss these issues and then get back to a point where we can continue to trade with each other? And same with the UK. The UK, in Jagtar Singh Jaggi's case, we've got Sikh MPs that have opened their speeches in Parliament by saying that India is our most significant trade partner. And for the next 100 years, India is going to be a crucial strategic partner for the UK. How can we get justice for Jagtar Singh Jaggi? So again, it puts us in the realm of Sikhs are this passive entity that we have experienced violence, that's isolated, that we are victims of that, and we need some kind of closure. And I think immediately following that recommendation, there's like multiple commissions that happened where India is trying to wrestle with this question of like investigation or trying to give compensation. One of the commissions recommended 10,000 rupees compensation, which is what, like £100? Insignificant per dead person, which is insignificant. And this didn't cover any insurance cover for burnt businesses or that were destroyed. No police officers are being dismissed that either took part in the violence or allowed it to happen. No serious political people are being punished. It's this continual drama of putting this question in front of us. So the West has either been completely indifferent or it's been complicit. But for me, the more important question is, why are we looking towards the West for anything? And in today's environment, what we're seeing in Palestine, how we're seeing sophisticated modern weaponry being used against not only Palestinian fighters, but largely against the civilian population, that's resulting in like horrific injuries, bombings of schools, hospitals, universities, killing of United Nations aid workers, killing of humanitarian aid workers, kidnapping, killing, torturing journalists, every war crime that's under the book, like looting and destroying civilian property, collective punishment, degrading and humiliating prisoners. Every single war crime is being committed in Palestine by the Israeli occupying forces. In full view of the world's media, well, they turn a blind eye to it, but it's happening, and there's military support and financial support coming from America, and military support coming from the UK to assist the Israeli regime in carrying out these mass atrocities. And now that Israel's targets have widened, they're carrying out. I mean, just today I was reading about how Israeli tanks fired upon UN peacekeepers, and this is completely unchecked violence. So, in this post-October 7th world that Sikhs are living in, we should be able to look at the Israel state's response to Palestine and how Israel's Western allies have responded. So we've seen like university protests across America. We've seen mass protests here in the UK, and the response from America and Canada, there's been university protests, has been to forcibly evict and remove those protesters, to censor them. Here in the UK, the media has been completely censoring coverage in broad terms, like covering up Israeli atrocities, and then debating about criminalizing Palestinian activists for raising their their slogans for freedom, like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, saying that that is an anti-Semitic slogan, and then criminalizing their flag, the display of their flag or their keffiyeh, like their symbols of Azadi. And we could see the same logic and the same approach being applied if Sikhs were engaged in an armed conflict against the Indian state on that scale today. We'd see the exact same thing, that the Nishan Sahib, the Khalistan flag, is a symbol of terrorism, that you're wearing a saffron dastar or you're wearing a kesari kapra or whatever, that's a symbol of terrorism, that all of this should be outlawed, all of this should be banned. Look, that's exactly what the UK government did following November 84. They put a ban on a Nagar Kirtan for Guru Nanak Badshah.
Just in case.
And in
case it was used to highlight the atrocities that happened in November. That's what that was about. And everything that Shamsher is talking about in regards to Palestine disproves the claim that if 84 had happened today, the world would have been different. We know Jay Sadi Gal, if they had known of what happened, the world would have reacted differently. The world knew then, and the world knows now. And the Western world, that is, it doesn't act any differently.
So in the previous podcast, you mentioned these commissions. You've just mentioned them again. So what are these commissions, and what was the government trying to do? You talk about investigations and so on. So, what is this stuff that they were doing?
So in regards to the government's legal response to the November genocide, firstly, it's important to remember that this was something that was campaigned for by Sikhs. The majority of the Indian community had no issues with the violence that took place, which is why the Congress Party won with landslide victories. So they didn't feel like they were mandated to do anything, because if the majority of the country are with you, why do you need to do anything? But there's certain other things that took place outside of India, which we'll go on and talk about later, which kind of forced India to have to look at a legal route. So it'd been 6 months following the massacres, and Rajiv Gandhi had established at least 4 inquiry commissions on different issues, and none of them were about the November massacre. When he was asked about this, and obviously there was a lobby to try and push for some sort of inquiry, judicial inquiry, in February 1985, Rajiv Gandhi claimed that by refusing to order an inquiry, he was shielding the Sikh people themselves. In March, he justified his refusal, saying that a commission would raise issues which are really dead.
So in that instance, that's always been the line, right, from the Indian state, that the Sikhs themselves, they brought this on themselves.
Okay.
And if we drag this issue up, it's just going to it's going to cause them more problems. It's going to paint them in the light of, the criminal, the deviant, the person who's undermining peace and security and harmony in India. And we don't want to drag these issues. It's better to let it die, like he says in the second time that this question of commissions or inquiry is brought up. And these commissions and these inquiries, they're brought up by retired like civil servant types, the Delhi elite types that are like, their consciousness is like shaken by the scale and the depravity of the violence that they've seen, that they've heard described, that's taken place in the capital of India. So they're calling on their government to say, we need to investigate, we need to find out, if politicians were involved, they need to be punished. If there's victims, we need to gather their testimony, we need to offer them compensation. It's like the bare minimum things that need to be done. And they're not dealing with any political questions, but even then, like their own people are asking for this, like their own people as in like the Delhi elites are asking for this. Even then the government's like, no, this isn't something that we want to do.
And when finally a commission was set up, it was 3 months before the Rajiv-Longowal Accord was signed by Rajiv Gandhi and Harjinder. So this was an agreement between the disgraced Akali leader Longowal, who had come out of Darbar Sahib with his hands up, he'd betrayed the oaths that he'd taken in regards to the Anandpur Sahib resolution. So the Rajiv-Longowal Accord is you can Google it. It's essentially a betrayal of the Anandpur Sahib resolution. Now, following the attack, the conversation or the struggle had gone further than the Anandpur Sahib resolution, according to Santji. That when the army enters the Darbar Sahib, want that Khalistan di need ki jawi. So that was considered in terms of Longowal betrayal. So he was.
Do you mind mention that a little bit? What was the betrayal? What was Longowal doing?
Explain it.
The betrayal of essentially the accord was an attempt by Rajiv Gandhi and his government to like Sheryl talking about before, placate the Sikhs, to give them something So we didn't get the Nanpur resolution that Tarmil Morcha was fought for. Following the Darbar Sahib attack, now it's Khalistan. So what Rajiv Gandhi was trying to do was offer the Sikhs even less than we were struggling for before 84. And that's why it was considered betrayal, because the water rights, the capital, all the major issues, they weren't involved. They weren't part of the Rajiv-Longowal Accord. And Longowal has no authority to do this as well, because obviously by this point he's no longer in any sort of position of power or authority. His power had been eroded from like the early 80s when he was seen to be complicit with the government, etc. So the Sikhs were moving towards Azadi, towards Khalistan, and he was trying to take us back to even before 84. But the reason why that accord is relevant is because the first commission, the Mishra Commission, is appointed in April, and this was 3 months before the accord. So the commission itself was only a way, because Longowal obviously would have said that after November we can't be negotiating and we can't be seen to be talking. You have to do something for November. So that's what that was for. The Mishra was a justice of the Supreme Court judge, and the People's Union for Civil Liberties criticized the commission for concealing information on the accused while disclosing the names and addresses of victims. It permitted cross-examination of the victims but did not allow representatives of the victims to cross-examine any of the government, police or army. It recommended no criminal prosecution of any individual, and it cleared all high-level officials of directing the pogroms. Mishra dismissed allegations against senior Congress party leaders such as H.K. Bhagat simply on the basis of their political positions. He said, by quote, Bhagat, being a sitting member of parliament and minister, was not likely to misbehave in the manner alleged. So even they had testimonials and affidavits and statements from hundreds of witnesses, and many naming Bhagat by name to say that what he'd done. We'd gone into the end of the second episode. Even though there was all this evidence, he dismissed it completely just based on the fact that he was an MP. And talking about, following on from what Shamshed was talking about in terms of the reason why Rajiv Gandhi, when he says, I'm shielding the Sikhs from themselves, it's this idea that it is your fault though. Like all this that took place was your fault. Written arguments submitted on behalf of the Delhi government sought to blame Sikhs for their own massacre. These are the written points that they had submitted in this commission. They allegedly celebrated the assassination of Indira Gandhi. They allegedly attacked first. So what they claimed was that the Sikhs had gone around. So there's an example that they gave as well, that Sikhs in the jurisdiction of Kalyanpuri, 600 Sikhs where 600 Sikhs were killed. The government alleged that an attacking crowd of Sikhs had spent the whole night celebrating, advanced towards non-Sikhs, sparking a confrontation. So they alleged that they celebrate the assassination of Indira Gandhi. The point 2 was that they attacked first, and the third point was that Sikhs in general had an anti-national character that further antagonized the mob. Justice Mishra was rewarded for his whitewashing of the massacres. After serving as chair of the commission, he was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. After retiring from that position, he served as the first chair of the National Human Rights Commission. So the National Human Rights Commission is the same commission that later on, during the human rights abuses that take place during the Sangharsh, the killings of innocent Sikhs that happened during the counter-insurgency measures by the government. This is the person who is chosen then to be the chair of that commission. He then goes on to represent the Congress party itself in the Rajya Sabha, or upper house of the national parliament. He dismissed allegations against doctors regarding their refusal to provide care to injured Sikhs. He said that Indian doctors, with their high spirit and tradition, could not have allowed themselves to be obsessed by the thought that 2 guards of the Sikh community had murdered the democratically chosen leader. So what he was saying was that, just like he did with the MPs, that there's no chance, there's no way that Indian doctors would have done this.
So they reinforcing the Indian states like propaganda narratives that the Indians are the civilized, sensible people and the Sikhs are the anti-nationals that deserve to be killed, and we can't take them for their word. We can't believe what they're saying. And this is, one of the most high-powered commissions, and it emerges from that push, from Longowal to say that you have to be seen to be doing something, that all of these commissions that have been delayed, one of them has to be started, or the request for a commission has to be started, so that we can say to Sikhs that, look, the government is giving us justice. Unhone inquiry kiti, unhone commission kiti, the prachar of that could be done to Sikhs, so that it keeps us in that position of victimhood.
It sounds like to me that they're saying that, like you said with that shielding thing, that because you guys, even though it's not true, the justification is that, yeah, you guys started celebrating and you started harassing non-Sikhs, and for that reason, that's why you deserve to get raped and killed and burned. Like, how is that any justification?
Of course. And we see as well that the Indira Gandhi's assassination is comparable to other world leaders such as JFK and
Franz Ferdinand.
And in this, and there's no type of violence that takes place in any of these assassinations, not even assassinations which were not on that scale. And the real reason why this violence takes place is, like Shamsher was talking about, that it was this idea of having to, for me, June was, Joyce Perry talks about this, and she said that the attack wasn't against an individual, it was against the spirit, this consciousness that had arisen, and they wanted to crush that spirit. And when that failed, because that's what November represented with the assassination of Indira Gandhi, it was the massacres that took place was to further try to oppress Sikhs back into their place, quote unquote. So the Mishra Commission gives a clean verdict to Rajiv Gandhi and other senior Congress leaders and doesn't find any reason for police inaction. The Dillon Committee in 1985, under veteran Congress leader, was instituted to look into the rehabilitation of victims and their families. A compensation of 10,000 was mandated for the families of those who'd lost lives, and 2,000 for those who had been raped, basically who had survived, had injuries, and that's £18. A critical recommendation of this committee was that insurance money be paid to those whose property had been damaged. Companies had denied the claim on the technical grounds that, quote-unquote, riots were not covered by the scheme. However, the government rejected this recommendation and no insurance company compensated any of the victims. Then we have the Kapoor-Mittal Committee of 1987. Their investigation was into the role of the police. They finally submitted a report in 1990, and they identified 72 police officers. Cases should be registered against 72 police officers. However, the Home Ministry rejected the report and not one officer was dismissed. Then there's the Jain Banerjee Committee of 87. They were set up to look into registration of cases against Congress leaders, and they recommended the registration against Sajjan Kumar and Brahmanand Gupta in August 87. No case was registered. Instead, Gupta filed a writ petition in the Delhi High Court, and the High Court upheld his petition and effectively disbanded the committee. So we've got quite a few of these still to get through. As I said, there was 10, but what you find is just it's a futile exercise. The government itself has no interest in providing any sort of, even though it can't provide us with justice, but they weren't interested for themselves to prosecute anyone that had committed.
And you're in 1987.
I'm sorry, 1987.
3 years afterwards.
So the Ahuja Committee was set up in 1987, mandated to assess how many people have been killed in Delhi. It's one of the least controversial commissions, and they put the number at 3,300 across the country, but most human rights organizations and I think that number is like wholly inadequate. Then there's the Poti Rosha Committee in 1990. Again, they were formed, and they again recommended cases be registered against senior Congress leaders. Again, no action is taken. Then there's the Jain Agarwal Committee in 1990. Retired High Court Justice Jain and DGP Agarwal examined 669 affidavits, and they again recommend the registration of cases against HKL Bhagat, Dharamdas Shastri, Jagdish Tyler, and Sajjan Kumar.
So in these affidavits that you're talking about, I remember reading once that wasn't there even fake ones that are made by Indians as well, saying the opposite.
Yeah, that's where you get the celebration. So the government had tried to falsify the records as well by adding their own thing. But the main thing was there was so much harassment, like Shamsher was talking about, how they had released the information of all the people who had come forward. So the number of people, like 669 affidavits in a pool of 30,000 people that were affected is nothing. But they did all they could to try and frustrate the process.
And I remember seeing the handwriting. There was something with the handwriting that was a bit weird, or the signatures, or the same person.
Oh yeah.
Languages and stuff. I think there was quite a few things that were quite sketchy.
There's the Narula Committee in 1993 recommends registration to cases against Bhagat, Kumar, and Tyler. These were some of the key individuals, and there was a lot of evidence against them. So So we're in 1993. That's nearly 10 years following the violence, and certain Congress leaders, time and time again, their names have come up. There's at this point, there's no cases registered against any police officers or any Congress leaders. It's interesting to note that on the 1st of November, of the 26, I believe, people arrested, all were Sikhs, and they were all arrested for fighting the mobs. Then we have the Nanavati Commission in 2000. Things had remained a standstill for 15 years, and a resolution was passed, and a new commission was formed under Supreme Court Judge Nanavati. It was mandated to complete his report in 6 months. It took 5 years, and after 5 years, in 2005, his report still referred to the massacres as riots. It cleared Rajiv Gandhi and other high-ranking Congress members of any involvement. And H.K.L. Bhagat, who was named in countless testimonies from 1984, dies the same year the report was published. Nanavati also heads another commission later, another controversial report, which gives Modi, it clears Modi of any wrongdoing during the Gujarat massacre in 2002. Then there's the Mathur Committee set up in 2014, spearheaded by a retired Supreme Court judge. It noted that a proper investigation of the offences committed was not conducted, and that there was some kind of sham effort had been made to give it the shape of investigations. The committee recommended the setting up of a special investigation team to examine other cases, and that was set up in 2015, and reopened a number of new cases, but then closed 186 cases without an investigation. Then the Apex Court decided to set its own special investigation team in 2018, and then a bench led by Chief Justice Mishra ordered the setting up of a special investigation team under the Supreme Court. So this is just essentially just up to 2018 now. So we're nearly
6 years ago.
Yeah. So and like 34 years on from the massacres. At this point, the first high-profile conviction takes place. The Congress leader Sajjan Kumar, who's been free for 30 years, is sentenced to life imprisonment, and then it's important to note that he's largely untouched for 25 years. It took the High Court 5 years to adjudicate the matter, and his case had come up before court 119 times. Over the years, 14 High Court judges had heard his case, and he was still untouched. And later, he was acquitted on some of these cases as well. And that's where we are right now. That was the last body that was set up, and Sajjan Kumar is one of the only people of some kind of a profile that was ever convicted.
So when you speak about all these commissions, like, the only thing that was going through my mind was like, what was the point of doing all this stuff? What was the point of doing all these commissions if it just sounds ridiculous what was kind of coming out of all them?
I think like this brings it back to where I kind of started, right? Like, how do we understand November? So on one hand, you have the commission, and the other hand, you have extrajudicial murder. And extrajudicial murder is problematic as a term because it implies that there's a legal way for you to be killed, that they just didn't follow the correct procedures, and we see the legal way of killing Sikhs by Satwant Singh being hanged, right? So that's the legal and correct way to deal with the terrorist Sikh body. So the commission and the state sanctioned murder, they're exactly the same thing. Mishra puts into gear the deterrent factor. That if you're a victim or a survivor, that you coming forward is going to put you more in danger than it is going to put a high-profile politician in danger. So from the very get-go, they put into place this deterrent for the survivors to come forward. And for me, it comes back to this point of there's no justice under occupation. The whole point of the commission, in order to understand it, it is a mechanism to keep us ghulam, to keep us subjugated, to keep us looking towards the state for justice, to keep us looking and asking this question that maybe the next commission, maybe this commission didn't do it, maybe a refined version of the commission will have an impact on us, and maybe then we will find out what happened. Because remember, like, continually the commission is not on this line of justice. That's our projection. The commission is on the line of, let's investigate. Let's try to find out what took place, how many police officers were involved, how many people actually died. And every single time the result that they come to, one, is completely fabricated. it's detached from reality, and two, it keeps us in the trap that they want us to keep us. So for 34, 40 odd years, this drama, this pantomime, this performance of this so-called notion of justice keeps occurring. And I fundamentally believe that it has a larger impact on the diaspora than it does on Sikhs in Punjab, because that word justice firmly enters into the Sikh language, and it becomes a part of our political identity, and it becomes part of our way in which we approach governments. So, we'll be like, we want justice, right? We want an inquiry. We want to do a petition. We want to know why there's no justice for Sikhs. The government should tell us. The Hayward Review should tell us, which was an investigation done in the UK to look at the relationship between the Conservative government and the Indian government and trade relations, etc. That the government should tell us what happened. As if, one, we don't know what happened. Two, we aren't capable of resolving this. And so the commission has to be understood as a mechanism of keeping us ghulam versus what was taking place on the ground before November 84, which was Sikhs struggling and fighting for their liberation. That continues all the way up into the mid-90s, where Sikhs are waging a guerrilla war for their liberation. So we have on one hand Sikh liberation, and on the other hand we have counter-revolutionary actions, anti-Sikh activity that the state's taking, which includes the commission, the extrajudicial murder, the Supreme Court trial, the media investigation, or whatever the government is doing, whether it's the planning policy, whether it's how resources are being allocated in Punjab, what weapons are being given to the police, what communications and surveillance technology is being deployed. Everything that the state does in Punjab to Sikhs is about keeping us locked into this position of either victimhood or potential terrorists, so we can be annihilated. And Sikh liberation completely turns that whole world on its head, because it presents this notion of justice after victory. It presents a notion of the Khalsa's fateh. It connects us directly to coordinates that are older than the Indian state, that transcend any worldly structure, that connect us directly to Akal Purkh and bring this idea of our Raj, of Badshahi, of imagining a society where people can live in harmony and balance, where the Khalsa can fulfill its function as the Guru Khalsa, where these ideas of Sarbat de Pale da Raj, Halemi Raj come right into the forefront, right? Like, so Sikhs can establish a type of structure that benefits all of the creators' creation, where domination and exploitation and oppression are fought against, and the Khalsa can uproot all of these oppressive forces. That's what Sikh liberation presents to us.
And that's true justice for what happened in June and November, right? Like
it creates the conditions for justice to even emerge, because the Indian state, there is no conditions for justice to emerge. What you've described is like, I'm listening to it, and there's like this deep sense of it's like a frustration of it's like the like nails dragging on a chalkboard,
keep moving,
right?
The goalpost kind of
thing. Completely.
Just to give an example of that, the Nanavati Commission, which produces a report in 2005, that was 20 years since Delhi. And I remember that because that's kind of around the time when we were like 17, 18, and you remember this, that was like a big thing at the time. That commission clears Rajiv Gandhi and all high-ranking Congress party members. And that position was the same one that Mishra took in 85 when their commission was started. So the position doesn't change. And these mechanisms are for when we can't envisage another way.
And also what it does, it completely removes the Kharku Jathebandia and the Khalsa as a force from the battlefield. It destroys the battlefield that Sant Jarnail Singh and the Shaheeds revealed to us in 84. Because what they do is they set the ground for a struggle for liberation. So it completely destroys their hard work. It completely washes away their spilt blood or any trace of it. And it takes the Kharku and it marginalizes them, and it puts them in the category of, because in order for the commission to work, the Sikh is still a terrorist. The Sikh that picks up a weapon is still a terrorist that needs to be annihilated. They're not questioning the political setup. So in order for the commission to make sense and have validity, Indian law has to be upheld. And if Indian law is upheld, then state-sanctioned murder is equally valid as the findings of the commission. And that's exactly what the commission says, that you are responsible for your own suffering, that nobody will be held to account, and will give you £18 if you suffered at the...
If you were raped multiple times for 3 days. And just to there's one point that came to my mind when I was thinking about this. If you look at the practical reality or the likelihood of quote unquote justice within India, Rajiv Gandhi, there's substantial evidence firstly that something like this couldn't have taken place without him anyway, but also eyewitnesses that when he landed in Delhi and they went to meet him, he said to them, "What are you doing here? My mum's just been murdered. Like, what you do? No turban should be seen in Delhi, innit?" So there's countless accounts of him officially ordering that violence. His approach to it afterwards shows how he was completely sehmat with that. And for justice to have taken place within the Indian setup, he would have to have himself hanged. It's a farcical idea that he would say, yes, we need justice. Who was responsible? It was me, wasn't it? So this idea of justice within India doesn't kind of make any sense. But it's only when we can't imagine, or we're afraid of looking at other means or other methods like that are more consistent with Khalsa ideology. So when I was reading out those extracts of what was discovered about the British government, what they were talking about during 84, when British Sikhs found this out and these reports were published, our response to that, not ours as myself, but other Sikhs in the UK when these things came out, their response was, 30 years later, Sikhs still have not had justice for November 1984 and are holding a series of awareness-raising events to continue to exert pressure on UK politicians to compel the Modi government to take action. So this is the quagmire that we're stuck with, isn't it? So we've just found out, to confirm that the British were involved and complicit, and now after 40 years, it was 30 years at this point, after 30 years we're saying, okay, can you put pressure on yourselves to put pressure on Modi now? And it's just absolutely ridiculous.
Earlier you said something, G, about how this is having more of an effect on diaspora Sikhs than on Sikhs themselves in India. What did you mean by that? Why is it not having as much an effect on Sikhs in India than it is on those in the diaspora, where you spoke about justice and so on?
Sikhs in Punjab were responding to November by continuing to engage in militant actions. They were responding to November by assassinating individuals that were responsible, by carrying out bombing campaigns in the heart of Delhi, by organizing jailbreaks for Sikhs that were arrested following the occupation of Darbar Sahib in June 1984. Figures like Bhai Sukhdev Singh, Sukha, Bhai Harjinder Singh, Jinda emerge onto the scene. So their response was completely different. Their coordinates, the way they were understanding this, was still the battlefield of June 1984, that we're in a state of subjugation. Santji's proposition that in conditions of subjugation, in conditions of Gulami, that you are going to suffer at the hands of the occupying force, that they're going to commit multiple atrocities. So when Sanji talks about Biadbi that's taking place under the Indian government at that time, where like previous occupying regimes, whether it's the Mughals or the British, they try to attack the connection the Sikh has to Guru, because for them, by distorting and trying to destroy that connection, they believe that they can destroy and finish the Sikh. So Sanjay Janelle Singh says that the Biadbi that's taking place is related to the conditions of Gulami. So they're not viewing it as something separate. They're not viewing it as an isolated incident that occurs. They're viewing every single incident that takes place as symptomatic of these conditions of Gulami. So the Sikhs in Punjab that then rise up and respond to that, they're viewing it from that position of Asi Gulamia, Asi Azadi Leni, that we're in a position of subjugation, that we want our liberation. We want to address the shackles. We want to destroy the shackles. We're not going to look to the Mishra Commission for justice. In fact, if Arjan Das is named in who are the guilty, we're going to put our Arjan Das in our crosshairs and we're going to assassinate this individual. So they carry on. And again, it brings back a previous point from a previous podcast of the nature of Sikh violence versus the nature of the state's violence. So continuously you see the nature of Sikh violence is to assassinate individuals deemed responsible for atrocities. And the Indian state's violence is mass atrocities, sending tanks into Darbar Sahib, raping and murdering civilians within Darbar Sahib after they've gained control of the complex, right? All the Kharkus have been shaheed, all of their fortified positions have been erupted. They distribute 100,000 bottles of liquor and allow their soldiers to commit mass atrocities on the Sikh civilians that are taking shelter in various positions within Darbar Sahib. And that same nature of violence is seen in November, where a bottle of alcohol and 100 rupees is distributed, and these death squads are organized and orchestrated and deployed to punish Sikh civilians for the crime of having a political position that challenges the very nature of the Indian state. Remember, we talked about in the previous episode that this was planned to take place in November during the Gurpurb of Guru Nanak Badshah, that this was going to occur regardless. And then following November, we see Operation Woodrose, Operation Shuddhikaran, Operation Black Thunder, where the state's violence again takes form, where they go into villages and they torture, they kill, they burn Sikhs alive, they target the families of Sikh Kharkus, Sikh warriors, they arrest and torture and mutilate their family members, where they arrest and they capture a Sikh guerrilla, they brutally torture them, and then they put their body in a field and shoot them and say, we killed them in an encounter, in a gun battle. So even after they've tortured them, they're fabricating the conditions within which Sikh death occurs. So the Sikhs that are fighting against this understand the structure that they're confronting. They're literally their comrades, those are that they're in the field with. So you got one Jathebandi, and they're hearing of their Sathi Singh Singhniya, and how a Singhni's been tortured, or how by Harjinder Singh Goldie's sister's been tortured and killed by the police. So they understand the enemy that they're fighting. So they have no notion or confusion about justice. For them, they're engaged in a liberation struggle. But Sikhs in the diaspora, because they're detached from that, they're viewing it from the position of the Ghulam. And that is lasting up until this day, where you've got like Sikh advocacy organizations advocating on behalf of Sikhs, but the politics that they're deploying is the politics of the Ghulam, the politics that accepts the state as a natural entity, the politics that wants justice from and protection from the structure that is designed to destroy and oppress them. And not just Sikhs, those same structures have carried out violence against multiple other communities. So it's not just that I'm looking at it from a Sikh perspective, right? Like that, what did India do to Sikhs? India has done the same thing in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Nagaland, against the Tamils, in many cases using Sikh soldiers. The state Britain's done the same type of scale of violence in East Africa, in Kenya, where they were fighting against the Mau Mau, where they were fighting other rebellions against their rule. They did the same thing to the indigenous people in North America, etc. So that nature of the state's violence always looks like brutality against civilians, and it's creating these conditions of your death. But yeah, I think Sikhs in Punjab view and responded completely differently.
In regards to this idea of in the Indian legal system, sometimes people think that it's because it's slow, or it doesn't work very very well, etc., etc. One thing to note is that following the assassination of Indira Gandhi, on the 31st of October, they had stenographs, photography of the site. They drew it. They interviewed everyone that was at the residence. They even tried to interview Bhai Singh, but the surgeon said that he's undergoing an operation. They wanted to interview Indira Gandhi, but she wasn't available. And essentially, they bring a magistrate, and they frame charges against Bhai Singh for attempted murder, and then later change those charges the same day for actual murder, because she's finally pronounced dead. The whole process takes place in a day.
So just from what you're saying, I have just some reflections of the podcast so far. That it's interesting that for the past 3 episodes we've carried on in history, right, from November, and it's like when we talk about this individual Sanjay Singh ji, they're out of the picture now, right? Respectful in that way, but look at all the stuff that's still happening. Before, it was all about removing Santaji, right? They were the main character, but even though now Santaji is gone physically, but look at all the stuff that's still happening, and with these commissions that you spoke about, it's like, but it's still our fault. But then it was all about, Santaji is doing this. It's all, what they're pushing, but they're gone now physically. I say that respectfully. But all this stuff is still happening. And a point that you made, well, where my question comes in, is about this idea of a spirit. And I think one amazing thing that you said was that, and it was something that I've taken away from the podcast, is that a lot of this stuff that we're learning is not for us to kind of, it's not just to show the world, it's for us to look at. Like you said, like the Sakya of Bhai Garaja Singh Ji and so on, that it was to remind the Sikhs of their spirit. And what Santaji was doing in that instance was remind the Sikhs of their spirit. And what I guess I'm seeing from what you're saying is that in India, that spirit was still there within the Sikhs. And so is that the case? And those Sikhs in Punjab, they had the spirit. And who are those individuals then? So from November going forward now, where was this spirit then? That kind of feels like it was lost. Or was it lost or was it not lost? So where is this spirit basically?
I mean, like 100%, I'd agree. Like that spirit definitely has much more presence and grip in Punjab. Or Tartiya, Guruan di Tartiya. And if you look at June, the conditions before June, where Sikhs were, the multiple agitations that they had gone through, between that 1849 to 1947 and then following 1947 all the way to 84, when they were looking at their conditions, they were drawing this continuous picture that stretches back from Guru Nanak Badshah, like what is the fight that we're engaged in. They were looking at the Misl period, they were looking at how Sikhs fought against Abdali, they were looking at the environment where Sikhs were outnumbered. And we talk really romantically about this period that there was prices on the Sikhs' head. We remember in our ardas the sacrifices that our ancestors have made, and that was continuously present for them. And in the way they articulate what they were fighting for and where they were drawing their inspiration from, they're talking about the positions that the Guru Sahib took against the Mughal Samraj, that they didn't back down, that they fought for the place of the Sikh in the world to exist as the Khalsa. So they were very clear in their politics, in what they're fighting for and how they saw everything. The Sakya that they were telling stretched back all the way across Sikh Ityas, and that galvanized the Sikh spirit. It brought this desire, this reimagination of Azadi, of Badshahi, of Khalsa Raj back into the consciousness of the Sikhs. It took them from this passive body that are going to engage in quote unquote peaceful, non-violent and peaceful protest into picking up weapons and arms and engaging in conflict with the Indian state. So that was like the work that Sant Jarnail Singh does, where he awakens and galvanizes this spirit, and he organizes Sikhs into what would then become full-fledged armed, like Jujaru Jathebandia. Sant Jarnail Singh puts all of those pieces into place, and then despite like this huge wave of violence, so Kallu Kara of November, that again is arguably paralyzes the Sikhs in the diaspora, but it doesn't have that impact in Punjab. It doesn't. One of the points Baljeet Singh mentioned earlier, the Sikhs' militant response wasn't largely about avenging November. It was about a liberation struggle, and they engage in militant actions. They engage in militant strikes based on that nishana, based on that target, that we are fighting for our liberation now. That the Indian state has no moral authority. It will commit atrocities, and they will continue to face the November-like atrocity, the state violence. They continue to face that throughout the entire period of insurgency. So one Sikh, Singh described it that the Sikhs were out-violenced by the Indian state. That they were willing to go into a village and pull somebody's gates down and bring out everybody from the pind, arrest all the youngsters, and strip all of the Buzurg and the Bacche and the Bibia naked, and commit and allow the police officers and the paramilitary troops to commit mass atrocities. That they had crossed all limits of their humanity. By Gurdeep Singh Debbu is like boiled alive by Indian security forces. The way in which by Anok Singh is brutally tortured. Continual violence inflicted upon Sikhs, and that's like, we could do a whole podcast just looking at the Indian state's counterinsurgency violence, how
Methods,
they responded, their methods, and how they responded, and even then that question of human rights violations comes up, right? Where that same equation is in play with Sikh insurgency of we want justice for the human rights violations committed by Indian paramilitary forces. But again, that takes away this question of Sikh liberation and what they were fighting for, and presents us as the victim. So like that spirit that's galvanized is moving Sikhs forward in a conflict against a much larger, superior force that has no standards of warfare. Their standards of warfare, are like, we're going to behead your children and we're going to torture your family to death. And Sikhs don't engage in warfare in that way.
And as you were speaking there, I was thinking about what you said earlier about that the Sikhs of that time, that they understood the structure that they were facing against. Because it's interesting that in their writings, in their statements, they don't complain about the torture and shahidi of Bhai Anok Singh. So they don't ever complain, or there's no appeal, human rights international, etc. They never, that's never part of their discourse. They are definitely aggrieved by the human rights abuses that are committed against the armed Sikh, and that's why Sikhs like Baba Manachar would write to KPS Gill in the papers and say that, listen, stop harassing the innocent Sikhs. If you want to bring any force you want, I'll meet you anywhere you want. And talking about the Sikh response, they took Seth from like Puratan history and like the Khalsa's Maryada, because it reminds you that the Kallukare from before, what was the saying? This is say Manu Sadi Datri Asi Manu de Soe Jo Manu Varda Asi Don Soai Hoye. So even during the Kallukare in the past, they never approach it like we have to assassinate that individual. They just see it as lachan of symptoms of us not being in Raj. And like you were saying, that the Sandesh was to the Sikh that we have to, the ones who have survived have to move forward to take Raj, because that's the only way that type of society can come into place where these types of atrocities won't take place for anyone. So when we speak about Sant Janel Singh Ji, the Indian government had this misconception that if we assassinate this individual, that we can stop this revolution. And then they realized it had like spread through the Punjab countryside, through the towns, the villages, and that's where Operation Woodrose comes in to essentially try to wipe out a whole generation. But what they have no understanding of, or is completely outside of their sochni, that Sikhs that were in Delhi, that were in the Prime Minister's residence, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਅਣਖ ਜਾਗ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ, and Maharaj can do kirpa in that way, and that even though they were completely separated from what was happening in Punjab and from Sant Janel Singh Ji, but through what was happening and what Sikh believe is that this is the effect of shahidiyan, like when that blood is spilt, the ground wakes up. And we hear it in Punjabi poetry and Tad Divana that like they literally, I think you remember you saying that they sprout from the ground itself. And that's something, that phenomenon is something that the government could never contend with, could never stop. So when we speak about the spirit and how Sikh resist November, how Sikh respond, a few days after the Delhi massacre, Bhai Manjeet Singh, aka Lal Singh of the International Sikh Youth Federation, lands in Alabama in the United States. Him with a few others, they enroll into a mercenary training camp run by a US vet, an army vet, Frank Camper. They're given guerrilla warfare training, and this group of Sikhs in America then plot the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in May 1985. So we're talking less than a year from November, his assassination, and also the assassination of Chief Minister of Haryana, Bhajan Lal, who, if you remember from the previous podcast, had stripped Sikh Bibiyan naked on like the GT road and committed a lot of atrocities. So they planned the assassinations of both those who were they were on a state visit in May 1985. The FBI were alerted, and they had to intervene to prevent the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. and Bhajan taking place, and they were shocked to their horror, in fact, that the Sikhs had set up a training camp in New Jersey where they were doing their own training, having learnt from other sources. Bhai Manjeet Singh and Aman Singh not only escaped the FBI dragnet, but then go to Canada, where they were able to evade the Canadian intelligence. And Bhai Manjeet Singh eventually makes it back to Punjab, where he remains fully active in the Khalistan Sangharsh under the Khalistan Liberation Force. He was arrested in 1992. He tries to bite his own tongue off to prevent giving any information. He spends 28 years in jail. And the reason I gave his Sakhi of his Jeevan, because when he was released recently, his statement was, for the past 36 years, I've had the great good fortune of passing my time as a lowly servant of the Khalsa Panth. For the future, my ardas is in the charan of Akal Purkh, that somehow as a lowly Sikh servant continue to take your seva from me. This is after 28 years. So this is the type of the Gursikhs that were getting involved at this time.
So just to come in here as well, like, I can't stress this point enough, that when we talk about justice and from the government, we're taking these individuals like Lal Singh, who's just one out of a countless number, out of a generation that rose up. We're taking those individuals out of the equation, and we're taking their politics, their commitment, their spirit, and we're completely devaluing it because it's not part of the conversation. If you're having a conversation about justice, you can't talk about Lal Singh getting guerrilla training in Alabama to go and assassinate another Indian Prime Minister. That falls into the realm of terrorism. So when we're talking about when we frame the conversation from the perspective of justice from the state, Sikh liberation, Sikh resistance is not part of that at all, and it marginalizes them in a way that is similar in nature to the violence of the Indian state itself. Because the purpose of the violence of the Indian state is to destroy that spirit, is to remove any Sikh Jajaru, Jathebandia from the ground, to destroy their families, to destroy their homes even. In countless cases, they've demolished the homes of Sikh fighters, and to keep you in either the concentration camp or in the ground of indoctrination, in the school, in service to the Indian state, in however they see fit. Like, we talk about the example of the coin being...
I think of the same thing. That all the way through this podcast, all I keep thinking about is how it relates back to that.
It is a level of violence that when we take out the Kharku Sangharsh and the Kharku response, and we put only the state there as the entity that we're engaging with, because that's the purpose of the state's violence.
And the International Sikh Youth Federation was one of the groups that were active at this point. In May 1985, there is this huge transistor bombing campaign that takes place. A little bit of a background to this is that some of the Singhs who, having escaped Delhi of all the violence that took place, travelled to Punjab and wanted to get involved in the armed Sangharsh. They crossed over to Pakistan, where some of the members of the Babbar Khalsa were there, and they relate these stories to them about what happened, what had just happened to them, and what they'd witnessed. Bhai Anok Singh is so moved by this that he himself travels to Delhi with Bhai Manmohan Singh and speaks to Bibiyan, speaks to survivors, and when they hear of the violence that takes place, the atrocities that take place, they then lead this campaign that targets Delhi, UP and Haryana. And according to the DCP of Delhi at the time, Mohd Kant, 85 bombs had been planted by, and this is a key thing, the individuals that were in part of this campaign under Bhai Anok Singh were victims and survivors of the Delhi genocide themselves. So they went and armed and supported those Sikh in Delhi who didn't want to file affidavits. They wanted to take badla. They wanted to take justice in their own hands, and because they were victims, survivors of the Delhi genocide, the bombs were concentrated in areas where most of the violence took place. And I think it was over 2 days, 49 people were killed, and the whole of north of India was paralyzed because obviously everything was shut down. And we managed to speak to one of the members of the Babbar Khalsa at this point to understand this campaign, because if you look at the rest of the Sangharsh, like, this campaign is kind of different. It's quite widespread, and it targets quite a lot of targets in one go. And what the Singh said to me was that At this point, there was about 35 to 40 members of the Babbar Khalsa. It was a small group at this point. It was those who had survived the Battle of Amritsar, essentially. And what he says was that when we had heard of this massive atrocity that had taken place across northern states in India, of tens of thousands of people being shaheed over 3 days, we needed to make a statement, but also a var back to the government for them to understand that that this kind of violence from them won't be tolerated, and that we will stand in front of it, and we'll attack you with great strength. And it's interesting that while Shamsher Singh was talking about, we hide this part of the history, we don't do justice to the Jujarus, we just concentrate on a certain aspect of this history. The interesting part is it's directly related to the actions of the militant movement that things take place, or things are changed, or essentially that the government listens. Because if you notice that, I mean, I'm only halfway through some of the actions that take place in direct response to Delhi, but no such massacre has ever taken place against Sikh in India ever since. So very, very quickly, when Rajiv Gandhi, this assassination attempts have been taken against him, there's bombing campaigns against all those that were involved in it. Straight away that's what made them sit up and listen. So it wasn't the lobbying for commissions where he's saying that these issues are dead. That's not what kind of got his attention. That's not what got him afraid for his safety, and changed their approach to Sikh in that sense. And like Shamsher was talking about, that the violence that took place during the Sangharsh in Punjab with the families, a lot of the really the worst forms of that violence, or like the huge numbers of casualties, that takes place towards the latter end. I remember this interview with this Bibi who was talking about how even though her Singh, her husband was like a commander in the Khalistan commando force, the police never entered the village. It was only after his shahidi that then they started to harass the family. So that, like we said in the previous podcast, that the Jujarus were always like a dal, innit, like a shield for the people. And Bhai Manmohan Singh is shaheed in this campaign. He's apprehended by the police, and it was only through the Jathebandia, the Babbar Khalsa, who put out a statement to claim him as their shaheed, because the police couldn't get any information out of him. They asked him his name, and he would just say Singh, and that like he's from Anandpur. And in the end, they tied him to a pole outside the police station, and the people in that area, they stoned him to death. So one of the Tishidi on the and then we have in July 1985. So look at what's interesting is when we spoke about the commissions, we were up to like 20 odd years later, but we're in July right now, and there is the Delhi group that's mobilizing by Sukhdev Singh Ji Sukha, by Harjinder Singh Ji Jinda, by Ranjit Singh, by Satnam Singh Bawa. And one thing's interesting, a lot of those names, a lot of people will be aware of. They were really, really high profile members of the Khalistan Commander Force that's formed later in 86. But what's really interesting for me is that the depth to these groups as well, and how much work that we've got to do to try to understand more and learn more, is that they actually considered Bhai Matra Singh in their group like their leader. And I don't even think there's a photograph of Bhai Matra Singh, and he was like the mastermind for a lot of their operations. And yet he and all of them, they respected Bhai Bakshi Singh as their leader, and he was shaheed in Darbar Sahib in June, on the 6th of June, and he was one of like Santi's really close right hand men. And Bhai Harjinder Singh Jinda is kicked out essentially by Bakshi Singh, and he says to them and their group that, listen, you guys have got to continue this fight. So this is the Doordarshani of Santji, that he knew what was to come after. That's why a lot of these individuals were already in the field ready for what was going to take place afterwards.
So when you say kicked out, as in
essentially,
the Darbar
yes,
side?
they wanted they knew that the battle was going to take place.
Yeah.
And they were forcibly removed. Like Harjinder Singh Jinda wanted to stay with by Bakshi Singh, but him and his Sathis were told that, like, you guys can't.
Interesting.
You have to continue the struggle after. So this is where, like, we're going to fight and you guys are going to fight afterwards. Even some of the areas in Delhi where Sikhs held their ground were because of weapons that were sent out from Darbar Sahib, and Sikhs were able to fight in Delhi, and Bhai Harjinder Singh Jinda was involved in that. And again, this group mobilizes and they use who are the guilty. We spoke about that this report earlier which lists some of the key perpetrators of the Delhi genocide, and it's by Surjit Singh Ji Penta, I think by Harjinder Singh Ji's cousin, who was again someone who had experienced the violence that took place, and he helps this group to find and locate all of these key perpetrators, and Lalat Makkan's one of them. On the 31st of July 1985, he's assassinated. Now, Lalat Makkan was a Congress trade union leader, a member of parliament, and metropolitan councillor, and he was witnessed paying mobs 100 rupees each and a bottle of liquor for each Sikh killed. Following his killing, the authorities sealed the capital's borders. They banned the public assembly of more than 4 people, and parliament was adjourned. He was also the founder and president of the National Confederation of Central Government Employees and Workers, and he used all of these connections during the massacres to maximize Sikh casualties. Rajiv Gandhi and Zail Singh rushed to the hospital where the bodies were taken to, and immediately after gunning him down, Harjinder Singh Jinda actually takes position outside the hospital with intention of killing Rajiv Gandhi when he visited, but he couldn't get a clear view. So this is, I think we're up to the second assassination attempt on Rajiv Gandhi, and we're only up to September. On 5th of September 1985, Arjun Das, the Congress leader, again part of the Who Are the Guilty report, he's also a member of the Metropolitan Council. He's assassinated by Harjinder Singh Jinda and Sukhdev Singh Ji Sukha. A lot of these Naujawan, like by Sukhdev Singh Ji Sukha and Harjinder Singh Ji Jinda and some of the other Sati Singh, they had to actually cut their case in order to take part in these actions and blend into the Hindu majority, and they had Hindu IDs. And one other thing the Sakhis is that I think Harjinder Singh Jinda had the Stern gun and just walked into the place pretending to be like a bodyguard, and then shot. And what's interesting as well is we talked about the difference in violence with the Sikh violence in this state. These leaders who were leading the mobs and were screaming for the Sikh blood and like shouting, and were very, very brave and aggressive and violent when they had mobs of 500. When the Singhs of the movement went to hold them accountable for their crimes, they were hiding under desks, and that's how they were killed. And then October 1985, the MI5 foiled an assassination attempt of Rajiv Gandhi during his state visit to the UK. 2 Sikhs received heavy sentences, and they do Khalistan the Jagare in the court. The MI5 director of the time lists Sikh militancy as the largest threat domestically. The 2nd of October, so I'm losing count, but I think we're up to the 4th or 5th assassination attempt of Rajiv Gandhi. The 2nd October 1986, by Kalamjit Singh tries to assassinate him. He'd witnessed several of his friends burnt to death, and he was dealing with that trauma. I think his gears were cut as well to try to survive and escape the mobs. And through all the trauma and the dukh that he had, the one thing that completely just set him off, and he had this, not connected to any Jathebandia, but had like a solo mission to assassinate Rajiv Gandhi, was when he has Rajiv Gandhi respond to the massacres for the first time and saying, that's not only natural that the ground shakes a little. So when he heard about his family and friends being murdered in that way, described as that's what pushed him over the edge in that sense. And he hides out in a tree where this public function is taking place, and Rajiv Gandhi was going to come there 2 days later, so he hides in the tree and fires a few shots at Rajiv Gandhi, and I think one of his bodyguard was injured, but Rajiv he survives. The Indian Security Services breathed a sigh of relief in 1991 when Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated by the Tamil Tigers, as up until his death, he was on the Sikh hit list, and internally it was accepted that it was only a matter of time.
Do you know why the Tamil Tigers
they assassinated him? Because I think India sent troops into Sri Lanka in 1987, and they committed atrocities in Sri Lanka. So he was assassinated.
Same type of atrocities as well, right? When we talk about the nature of the Indian state violence, so they commit the same type of atrocities in Tamil Ilam as they do against Sikhs. So burning of civilians, mass rapes, and human rights violations committed by the security forces.
Interesting.
And this is only like a small selection of the targeted response. This is Sake or incidences I can think of that are directly linked to someone who took part in the Delhi genocide. But if we zoom out, then it's the Sangharsh for Khalistan that I was saying that the creation of Halemi Raj, that's what the true response was from the Jujaru Jathabandis. It wasn't to assassinate the people involved in the massacres. The greater aim was and still is obviously Khalistan.
And that, until this day, India considers the revival of Sikh militancy and insurgency the biggest threat. That's why Khalistan continually comes up between India and its trade partners in every single conversation, in every single country where there's a Sikh population. So they continually try to demonize and repress Khalistan because of the fear that they have of Sikh insurgency once again formulating, Sikh militant formations entering into the battlefield. They're not worried about another commission or another human rights inquiry, because as we've seen, when we chart these parallel histories, on one hand you've got the history of the counter-revolutionary activity, which is this drama and this play of justice which spans the same period of time, and there's no progress. And when you look at the struggle of Sikh liberation, which presents a whole larger worldview to the Sikhs, and rocks the foundations of the Indian security establishment, they fear that aspect, not this aspect. And we've seen like high profile things that have happened. The Sikhs have said, oh, look, Justin Trudeau has said something in Parliament that hasn't stopped India from committing violence against Sikhs. After that inquiry, when we saw Jaggi's case, right, everyone's like, oh, Jaggi's been arrested now. This is such a massive moment. After Jaggi's arrest, India's assassinated and targeted multiple Sikhs, raided the houses of Sikh activists, continually pushing this anti-Khalistan Sikh terrorism agenda to marginalize and remove Sikh resistance from the equation. That the only avenue open to us for any settlement is an avenue that literally goes nowhere, that ultimately ends up in the United Nations. If we pursue this path of like justice or truth or reconciliation, it ends up in the United Nations, and we can see every other movement that's ended up in the United Nations. I think one point there was like a 1 million petition signature
Geneva,
thing that went to Geneva, right? So we've seen multiple of these same approaches, that the goal is, if India doesn't work, then we want to go to the United Nations. We've seen, again, the example of Israel is so important. We've seen, condemnation from other nations. We've seen Israel be taken to the International Court of Justice, where it's been declared that their occupation is illegal, the violence that they're carrying out is war crimes, but it still hasn't stopped Israeli aggression and violence and occupation. They've expanded and they've been armed by their allies to, carry out these atrocities in a much more methodical manner. And the same, we've seen the same thing with Sikhs, like following Darbar Sahib. Like, what bigger jolt do Sikhs need? Following the attack of an invasion of Darbar Sahib, the massacre of civilians, following the mass atrocities in November, Indian state's machinery is continually being deployed against us, and no human rights inquiry, no petition has put a stop to that. And the only time you see Indian security forces step back and rethink their approach is because of the response of Karku Jathebandia.
So after Rajiv Gandhi, is it that the end? Is it carry on? What happens afterwards? Who else?
Well, after that, Vedya is assassinated in '86 as well. He was the army chief of staff who led the attack on Darbar Sahib, and then following that wave of militant activity in '86, there's the Sarbat Khalsa, where Khalistan is formally announced, and then Jathebandis are formed and fight for the creation of Khalistan. So, like I was saying earlier, that when Baba Manachald's fighting the CRPF in Punjab, that's not dissociated from November, because it's part of that struggle.
And the fact that Sikhs in Punjab regroup and mobilize so quickly after the atrocities that are committed in 1984, June and November. 86, they're gathering to have a Sarbat Khalsa, where despite military curfews and arrest and dispersal orders, you have 500,000 Sikhs turn up at Akal Takht Sahib to declare their undying support for Khalistan, that this is the nishana of the Qawm. So much blood has been spilt by civilians and Jujarus alike, that we're on this path now of struggle. And then following that, you see a decade-long insurgency. So how can we discount that and not look at that as part of the history of November, not look at that as the part of the history of 1984? And then when we give that entire period a term, genocide, it kind of, goes back to my earlier point, is it's not an accurate naming of what we're seeing. The name is, this is the conditions of Galami. The name is, we're engaged in a Sangharsh. That's the politics that are the politics of the Khalsa, not the politics of the commission or the inquiry or this play of justice. The politics of the Khalsa take place outside of the framework, the legal framework of the state. A struggle exists, and genocide and human rights violations occur because you cannot, you're not deemed human, and you cannot get what you want from the state. So because you can't get Khalistan or your freedom from the state, therefore you can be destroyed. You're wanting and you're asking for something, or you're struggling for something that is beyond the confines of this structure. It can't give it to you. And because you're asking for something you're not allowed to have, therefore is justifiable to destroy and annihilate you. So therefore, Khalistan and Sikh politics, actual Sikh politics, exists outside of any other legal framework or any other, we talk about miri piri, right? Like temporal and spiritual, like outside of any dunyavi, par adin sanstha, any other subordinate entity, that the Indian court is subordinate to the Indian state. The Akal Takat doesn't fall under that. The Akal Takat isn't underneath any par adin sanstha. And this was the politics of the Jujarus. So when they're talking about the society they're envisioning a society where people aren't crushed by Brahmanism, they're not crushed by the violence of caste, poor people aren't exploited, their labor, their kirt isn't exploited, and we're not exploiting the land either. That's what when they're fighting for Sarbat de Paledal, Raj Hale Mira, just a society they're envisioning. Is a beautiful dream of Guru Sahib's hukam, sab sukhali vuttiya e hua hale mira jiyo. So they're envisioning something that is beautiful, but they're not allowed to have it. So that's where the root of the conflict is. And that's why we see like this really depraved, like unhuman violence that takes place in November to punish Sikhs for June 1984, to punish Sikhs for daring to make a continuity between the Khalsa and the Sikh of today and Guru Nanak Padshah's Padshahi. That's what they're trying to disrupt with this level of violence. So if you, the analogy of the gold being melted is like really visceral and real, that the melting is the melting of our flesh in order to be cast into that coin. So it's like, for me, it's really difficult to put in, I've used the word violence probably like 100 times, but it seems so inadequate. I remember, saying this in one of the previous episodes, it's such inadequate language to describe, the absolute horror of being put into this mold of citizenship. It strips away our Padshahi, it strips away our any claim to sovereignty, and it puts us in this passive position where Sikhi becomes an identity, a personal identity, and existing as a Sikh becomes a personal religious practice. You go to the Gurdwara for your peace of mind because you had a hard day at work. But you can't imagine and you can't ask for and you can't struggle for the world that Guru Sahib is showing us, that our ancestors have fought for, that, when we celebrate the Shote Sahibzade, the spirit, they weren't martyred and they weren't butchered brutally because they refused to convert to Islam. It's because they refused to accept a world in which they were Ghulam under another structure. And as children, they realize that they enter into the Nawab's door with their feet sticking out forward because they refuse to bow down in front of that system. So that is what's being stripped and taken away from us in that violence of the tire being put around someone's neck and their case being cut and the biadbi that's taking place, for the Surups, Gurdwara being burnt and looted. They're trying to break that connection, and the Kharku is reforging that connection. So the same way Simran joins us to Akal Purakh, their actions in the battlefield rejoin us to that Sikh cosmology. So how can we disconnect the two? It's like a lobotomy is taking place. We're disconnecting an arm to understand a hand, but it doesn't make sense in that way. We can't understand our body as dismembered pieces? How are we meant to put our limbs back together?
And what's interesting as well, and it's really beautiful, is this isn't something when Shamsher talks about the principles of Ahle Miraj that the Jujarus were fighting for and continue to struggle for. These aren't things that we are in hindsight or 40 years later we're trying to write in for them. That they're shooting, they're assassinating, they're fighting, and we're trying to put this tint on it or trying to make it look or sound amazing. In April 1986,
Anything that we say will, I feel, is wholly inadequate, like to explain their politics, but only their own like words can do it.
And in April 1986, when the Declaration of Khalistan is made, this is word for word, like I said, English translation, but so it has its limitations. But the policy of Khalistan will be as per the Guru's wish, Sarbat Pala, and a policy of encouraging brotherhood of mankind. The segregation of humanity based upon caste, lineage, or color will not be permitted, and such divisions will be abolished by the use of political power. So this shows as well that like this concept of badala, it's foreign to us. So this wasn't about anti-Hindu or kill Hindus or anything like that it's been portrayed as. So even a very short period after November and June, like Shamsher was talking about, like, and violence is still being taken place, like the counterinsurgency operations are still taking place in 86, and yet this is what we're feeling, this is how we're talking about, this is how we are visiting our struggle. Likewise, such other cruel and distasteful practices of social inequality, especially between Sikh males and females, will be removed through the use of political power. We are not interested in creating any upheaval or in shedding undue blood, and we expect the same from others too. We express our firm faith in resolving all the issues cordially and through a dialogue with the Hindu majority and government of India. We hope that the government of India will not be blinded by an anti-Sikh attitude underlying Brahmanism and will face the reality of giving recognition to the formation of Khalistan. So what I'm trying to say is that even after the violence that they are perpetrating against the Sikh, we don't change our Siddhant, we don't change our approach, we don't change our target. And we mentioned by Harjinder Singh Jinda and by Sukhdev Singh Sukha, again, these are individuals where if you look at it from the Indian state side, or if you look at it from without a Sikh lens, these are individuals who have assassinated Arjan Das, Lanat Makkan, Vedya, the DGP of prisons who was committing atrocities, huge actions that they took. But these are the words of them. We have won. There's a letter to their families. This is when they were given the Fansi. We have won. The entire Sikh community has raised its voice against oppression. Whoever fights against oppression has already won. We are not enslaved. We are free because we do not accept Gulami. We are fighting Gulami. We may be imprisoned in jail, but our hearts and minds are free to recite Naam and do Ardas for the Jati Kala of the Panth. These evil Gangus can chain our bodies, but they can never chain our minds. They cannot change our beliefs with their oppression and torture. And unfortunately, it's us in the West when we, even though we don't have the same risks and to us that they do, it's us who conform.
I want to give another example. So that's one example that you've given of the Shaheeds, like describing in their own words what they're fighting for. Another example that really sticks out to me is by Gurjant Singh Bodhsingwala when they write a letter to the Indian president, I believe. And I'm just going to read from it. And they say, the government tried one tactic to destroy the truth of Gurbani and the experiences of the Khalsa, but we have seen and are aware of your cowardly tactics to erase us. And he goes on to say, the truth is that sometimes Machjiwara jungles, the foundations of Sirhind and the land of Muksar wake up the sleeping lions and leave them surrounded in riddles, asking, guess what I am, and what are the intentions behind everything that has happened around us? What is your relationship with Sri Harmandir Sahib and the star you have on your head? Do you still consider it your pride and honor? If this is pride and honor, then what is the value of Sikh sisters who have lost and are losing their izzat by these anti-Sikh yobs? And what is the value of the innocent Sikhs who were killed in the genocide in Delhi, Meerut, Lucknow by these anti-Sikh yobs? Those who answer these questions, history loves them. The grace of God is blessed on them and they are shown the path to go ahead and continue their journey. The ones who aren't able to answer these questions, those people never have the courage to stand up for themselves and raise their heads in respect. These questions aren't just ordinary questions, they only come with unique opportunities, but once a person understands the answer behind the question, then that person is never able to sleep again. And then he goes on to talk about how we're inspired by our ancestors, and the stories that we're told as children aren't of like cops and robbers. They're of like our shaheeds, and our sights are true and pure, and our sights on innocent people. They're on those that are committing atrocities, and we're going to continue. That your people and your officers, they're made of clay. They're going to destroy and disappear, and we're tied to like Gurbani, and he talks about the atrocities that are committed. So they're very clear in their position and their politics. And you see that with Sukha Jinda, you see that with all of the the Kharkus of this time period, what they're fighting for and how they understand the continuity between Guru Nanak's Padshahi and the conditions that they're in, and the Galami, the subjugation that they're fighting against, it is crystal clear to them. And again, it's the clash between two worlds. One is the counter-revolutionary Ghulam existence, the Ghulam existence and the counter-revolutionary instruments that the state's deploying, whether it's its security forces or its judiciary or its academia or its media. And the other world is the world of Azad Khalsa Raj, the world of the Gurmukh, the world of Sikh Sangharsh, and those are inherently in conflict with each other.
Thank you for sharing that. And so far in the podcast, we've spoken a lot about the response, whether that was from the government through these commissions, which we can see were pushed through external sources, whether that was the Sikhs and certain elites within Delhi at that time, and even the response from the Jujaru Guru Sikhs as well at that time. But one thing that we really haven't touched upon in much detail, and also just an interesting point that I learned, was that a lot of those Jujaru Sikhs were those that were actually victims from Delhi, November 1984. And that was a big point that I think I've never heard before, which was definitely really interesting to hear. So thank you for sharing that. But one thing that we haven't really covered, which is really important, is that after, especially the last podcast, November the 3rd and going on, what about those victims? Those victims of November genocide, where have they gone? Did they go back home? You said they didn't have homes. You spoke about the 2,000 rupees, £18, or 10,000 rupees if somebody was killed, or some houses that if they were going to be rebuilt, but the insurance companies are paying out. So what happened to these victims of November 84?
And like the victims and the survivors is in order to understand their position, like they're victims and survivors in the world of the Indian state giving justice, right? So they're awaiting the Indian state's mechanisms, which I've named as like counter-revolutionary mechanism, anti-Sikh mechanisms. So they're waiting for those mechanisms, whether it's of their own accord or whether it's like human rights organizations, trying to get them some form of either compensation or redress. So they're victims and survivors of that structure, of the structure of the Indian state. So we talked about in the previous episode of Hond Chiller, the village where the bones were discovered by an engineer. And that's a poignant reminder of the state of the victims and the survivors. Like in that village that was targeted by, the death squads that were unleashed, that whole village was destroyed. And remember, the engineer discovers and sees a building with like Gurmukhi letters on there and thinks this is where the Gurdwara could have been. Ends up losing his job because he, brings that to the attention of the media.
Was that like 27 years after?
27 years after that the Hond Chiller is discovered. And their bones are just left there in this state of forgetfulness, of this state of like absolute like just erasure and neglect.
So that was that village or that area just completely abandoned there for
completely abandoned.
Wow.
Yeah, somebody had just rediscovered that village and they found literal bones of Sikhs lying there. So that's one really clear example of what happens to the victims of the violence, that they're pushed into this place of a deliberate forgetfulness. Those that survive in Delhi, survivors of sexual violence, like women, some of them like take their lives as a result of like the trauma that they've suffered. Families are pushed. Those that survive, that have lost family members, that are in camps, whether the refugee camps, and in some of them there's like 10,000 Sikhs. So there's tens of thousands of Sikhs displaced in multiple refugee camps. Many of those camps are set up by the Gurdwara. They're given langar. The government forcibly shuts down those camps. We talked about in the previous episode, water is shut off. We talked about one school in particular that was looted, a Khalsa school. Years afterwards, that building is still in a state of neglect and disrepair, and it's the way it was. Many of these burnt buildings and are left for years afterwards. And today, 40 years later, those survivors in Delhi that are living in these so-called widow colonies or living in communes areas, their children are in states of destitution, addicted to drugs, still awaiting that sense of justice, still being disempowered in that sense through this whole process. And on the other hand, where we add Sikh liberation and that world to it, that gives you a sense of humanity, and it gives you a sense of understanding and response. Yet the conversation we see around victims and survivors, what I've read is still they need to know what happened to their loved ones. They don't understand why this violence took place, so they're almost pushed into this sense of being completely helpless and being disconnected from the underlying structure of the Indian state that's inflicting this violence upon them. It's like, tell me why this happened to me. Why was, my husband killed in front of me or burnt alive? Or why was my family member subjected to such horrific violence? And that state of disempowerment comes from that status of them being victims. When the question of Sikh liberation is added, then all of those, what by Gurjant Singh Budhsingwalas, who's in Punjab, who's picked up weapons, who's on this path of struggle, those are the questions that are moving his soul and saying, you can't sleep now once you've looked at these questions and you're trying to answer them. By Baba Gurbachan Singh Manuchal writes in his poem that these same questions of Bapu di pag rol diya, someone's dastar is in a police station being taken off, the abuses that are inflicted, these questions are moving them. Bhai Anok Singh writes, par adin supne sukh nahi, that living in conditions of galami, that even in your sleep you can't experience sukh. So they're moved by these questions, and they're answering these questions, and they're understanding that the Indian state will always produce will always inflict violence on Sikh bodies to turn them into dismembered corpses that don't have a home and don't have anything, and they're looking to the perpetrator for justice. So the survivors are in a state of, many of them still remain in a state of destitution and desperation. I remember years ago, there's films and documentaries made about them. People come, galvanize votes, justice for Delhi has become the repeated electioneering slogan for them. So they're pushed into this perpetual status or victimhood. But it's only resultant. It's a product of that system, that structure, and it's tragic. It's completely tragic that they're disempowered in that sense.
With this being November, we're doing these podcasts, we're marking it, and then after November we come to December, something we spoke about just before we started the podcast with Bo, the month, and all the Shahidiyya in the past, and you just spoke about Gurmukh there and what they had to say about that transition now, where in the West we talk about Christmas and they got New Year's. It was quite interesting what they were saying, but I think it's really important, because what you're saying is that these Gurmukhs, they've not forgotten about what's happened, right? For us, it's quite sad to say that we go through phases in the year where it's November is Shahidi Sama for November, then December happens again, then at the end of December it's okay, we start celebrating. But these Gurmukhs, they remember these moments all the time. What was that you're saying, Afan? I think it was very powerful.
It's the breaking of this continuity. The state wants us to look at these incidences of June and November as isolated, or something happens in Punjab with an individual and then there's censorship, or an individual's killed in in another country, whether it's UK or Pakistan or Canada, and we're responding to that individual as a moment of injustice, or so the state wants us to keep us in this silo, but the Shaheeds are addressing it in a completely different way. They're looking at time completely differently. They're looking at as Sikhs that our Shaheeds, Guru Sahib is Hazar Nazar, that Guru Sahib and our Shaheeds are continuously present. So when they're fighting in, or when they're trying to articulate what the condition of the Sikh is, before June 1984, they're looking to what it means to be a Sikh of the Guru. They're looking to at this idea of how can we exist in a world where Guru Sahib and our Shaheeds are Hazar Nazar, they're continuously present, and they're rooted in that moment. So you see that continuation through all of the writings of the Shaheeds, whether it's like, Baba Gurbachan Singh Manochal or Sukha Jinda or Bibi Upkar Kaur or Bibi Bimal Kaur, everything that they're saying is pointing towards the coordinates of Sangharsh and Azadi and these deeper underlying connections. And they're viewing it as continuous, as we can't live in peace in conditions of Gulami and subjugation. And what we view, especially in the diaspora, is we move very, very quickly from, we remember June now, and then June's gone. And then we remember November. And this year, because it's 40 years, it's a nice round figure, and, it seems more poignant. And then from November, then we go into like the war, and we view that, many will view that with like a sense of sadness, not looking at the underlying message or the spirit and the excellence of the Khalsa and the Chardi Kala spirit of the Sahibzade and Mata Gujjar Kaur, and then go from that to New Year's. So we're moving like in a really like disconnected way, like through this notion of time that isn't ours, that's alien to us, but our notion of time is connected to a different set of coordinates. So for us, like summer, and like the way the Khalsas continue to describe the force, the structure that they're fighting as Samedi Sarkar, that government of the time. So if they're viewing that Sarkar as Samedi Sarkar, then which Sarkar are they viewing as Sachi Sarkar? What's permanent and what's impermanent to them? So when the Shaheeds like, this body is made of clay and dust, and I'm gonna smash this body against the wall of oppression, what are they viewing with the sense of permanence and impermanence? And I think November is important in that sense, because it forces us to look at that question of time, because November happens so soon after June, right? They happen in this is what I've always found like really kind of disconcerting, is November happens so soon after June, but they're viewed as like isolated things. They happen in the same year. They're related to the exact same underlying circumstances. The violence in November and June is carried out for the same reason, and the mechanism that is, once the Sikh Kharku and the Sikh fighter is removed, the Sikh civilian is treated in the same way, and the pattern is then, that set up there of state violence aggression response is then deployed across Punjab for a decade afterwards, and arguably till this day. Yet we look at June and November as, this was the genocide bit, and then some will say even June was the genocide bit, but like the Battle of June 1984 and the November genocide are two separate things. And that, like, to me, like it doesn't really make any sense. When you look at it from the Sikh perspective of what's underlying it, then it makes complete sense. Like, this is the nature of the Indian state and the nature of its violence.
Yeah, in regards to being the nature of the Indian state, I think, especially for Sikh in Punjab, and Sikh in Delhi, they were forced with this reality of what the Indian state was. So like the Battle of Amritsar is like through the security forces, through the army, and it's under media blackout, etc. When the violence happens in Delhi, the rest of the Sikhs are forced to have this realization of like what that government is actually like, and also their position in that place, because this is now the majority of the people who are in this country, how they feel towards you. Like when it's them, like these your neighbors, your previously your best friends, etc., when they are showing how they view you, how they feel towards you, I think it had a massive impact in terms of the movement, because that's when people who tried to kind of keep themselves away from things, or tried to disassociate themselves from what was happening in Punjab, now they're having to forced with this realization that the veil is completely removed. Now it's not just the armed forces, it's not just the civil administration, the judiciary, but also the armed person in India. This is how they feel towards us, and this is our future in this place.
And I think definitely on that point about how you said things are kind of broken up, and you've got like June, you've got November, and so on. That's not going to be the same with these podcast series going forward, right? Because it's not because it's just 40 years. It probably gave us the initial idea, to start with June and November, but Guru Kirpa, this is going to continue. So a lot of the stuff that we've been speaking about, even like you spoke about like Bhai Sukha, Bhai Jinda ji, and what they did, we're going to hopefully go through these jeevanies of these individuals, Bibi Bimal Kaur, Bibi Upkar Kaur. So much stuff still to come, right? So hopefully for the Sangha that are listening to these podcasts, this isn't the end just because it was 1984 marking 40 years. This is only the beginning of this seva in terms of highlighting this stuff. And a very nice thing to hear, which I like hearing, is when both off the camera, they both keep saying, look, we're not doing justice to this, there's so much more we've got to cover. And I'm thinking, great, we've got enough content to cover for a very long time. And just another important thing for those Sangha that have come to watch these podcasts, specifically in November 1984, there's so many podcasts already available on June 1984 that actually covered from 1469 up to 1984, and even going into the 1990s as well. So you have to watch those podcasts to even understand these podcasts much better, because there was so much information, at least 12 hours of speaking and information shared. There's also, make sure you check that out as well. And this is only the beginning. So if there's something specific that you would like to see covered in the future podcasts on specific topics, on specific individuals, on a specific period in time or an event, then please put those in the description. Please reach out to Basis of Sikhi, to NSYF, and to all the organizations. We'll put the links in the description as well. We'll make sure that we cover those going forward. Is there any final words, any final vichar that you guys want to share with the Sangat before we wrap up this special series of November 84?
For me, when I personally think about June and November 1984, and like this question of time is like something I've been continually like stuck on. When we started with the Seva National Sikh Youth Federation, like that was our fascination with the actions, the thoughts, the perspective of the Shaheeds. And as we've gone into that more and more, as we've looked at their politics in relation to the structure of the Indian state and the Indian state's allies, how we find ourselves in the diaspora, again, that question of like time and temporality keeps coming, because Guru Sahib continuously attunes our consciousness in a different way, yet we go back into our isolated, our Vishora, this illusion of separation between us and Akal Purkh. And when we look at June and November, and we look at all of the Shahidiyan, it completely shatters that notion for us. And for me, it should be like the biggest wake-up call for our generation, like it was in Punjab. And it's almost like they had their moment in Punjab. They woke up. They completely altered Sikh history forever. They put us on a trajectory and gave us names and words to describe what's happening. They put Khalistan, Sangharsh, Galami. It became part of our understanding of how we're going to name these conditions. It seems like in the diaspora, the disconnection is growing rather than being erased away, and that's why like June and November are such important touchstones for us, because they bring to life what otherwise we would see as history that's distant and a time that's distant. The Tarmi Sadi, it was different, they completely shatter those notions. So it's so important that we understand that Atyas, we understand that Sangharsh from that perspective. And it's not about we want to, like some people used to say to us that it's like you want to time travel back to, June 1984. It's not a question of time traveling anywhere. It's a question of the coordinates of and our consciousness, which is what the Shaheeds attuned themselves to in a uniquely Sikh way.
I think when you guys were talking about this idea of the calendar, like now June's come up and then November comes up, and then there's the month of Bull. I think the reason why that's different for us, as opposed to the Sikhs in Punjab, and especially the Sikhs that we were talking about, is that they were moving. So for when you guys were describing it, it felt like someone who's standing still, and the clock and the calendar and time is moving without you because you're not moving anywhere. And it's just like, now you're like, okay, now there's this month, now there's this month. And I think that feeling will stop you stop having that feeling when this becomes part of like your actual movement forward and how you fit into it. And I think the other message I think is really important is that if we're to do justice to these massive incidences that have happened in Sikh Itihas, to remember, like the Gursikhs we spoke about today, that it's not separated. It's part of this. It's part of the longer this tapestry, this Sikh Itihas, and literally you could describe any part of Sikh Itihas with any date. It's exactly the same. So if you look at the Chota Kalukara and the Vadda Kalukara and the Kalukara that happens in November 1984, the way Sikhs mobilize, the way they understand what they're facing, what they need to do and move forward is exactly the same way. And I think we should take Seth from that, we take inspiration from that. And if we're going to do Prachar and talk about Sikh Itihas, then in the same way when we speak about it, like saying the Tharmis are we don't erase Sukha and Matab Singh, then let's not erase Sukha and Jinda as well.
My Guru, thank you so much for that, and thank you for the 3 episodes that we've done together. Again, a lot of time and energy has gone into it, so we really do appreciate all the courage and the energy that you guys do put into delivering these podcasts for us. And I know at times it's been very difficult as well, especially in part 2 is very emotional, so thank you so much again for doing this, Eva, and especially for the Sangat and for myself, getting to be here and getting to learn so much, a lot of the stuff that we've never heard before. And I think this is so important. This, again, like I said before, it's like the beginning of a new chapter of looking into this Itihas, and I hope Guru Kirtan in the future this becomes a resource for people in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because we don't want to lose history. And it's crazy how much stuff I see you scrolling in your laptops, how much stuff you lot of research and stuff. So thank you so much again. And for the Sangat again, please send in your messages, and this is just the start. So please make sure that you share and you subscribe to the channel, and Guru Kirtan going forward to have more content. But for now, we finish off here. Thank you so much again, and thank you to the Sangat at home. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.